Welcome along, fellow Beatle people. Welcome to the Beatle People Podcast. As you know, I've written a bunch of books and have produced a lot of videos and documentaries about the homes of the Beatles and other luminaries. And so it seems like that's the best way to get this podcast up and running. This time around, we're going to talk about Friar Park and some of the top questions I get asked about Friar Park. As you know, it was purchased by George Harrison for he and his wife, Pattie Boyd, in early 1970. Most Beatle fans consider Friar Park to be a part of the history of George Harrison. But I look at it the opposite way. I consider George Harrison to be a part of Friar Park's history. Unfortunately, all most people know about the Grand Estate is its association with George Harrison. But there is so much more to know about this incredible place. And I'm going to talk about that a lot in the Beatle People Podcast. Before I begin, please like, share, and subscribe to Beatle People on whatever platform you are listening on. Now please join me around the campfire. The number one question that I get asked from people is, how did you become interested in Friar Park? Well, surprisingly enough, it has nothing to do with George Harrison. You see, over the course of my life, I've always collected old newspapers and magazines, and I would sit on the floor and I'd go through them randomly. So one day, many years ago, I was going through a magazine and I saw a photo of a really beautiful house. I mean, this thing was enormous. And it was right up my alley. It was the exact type of English country estate that I always daydreamed about when I was a kid. And then I looked at the text of the article and I saw that it was owned by George Harrison, and the article was about a movie that he was producing that was starring Madonna. Once I was done reading the article, I set off to learn all about the house. And once I learned about Sir Frank Crisp, the brilliant man who built it in order to live there with his family and his many scientific interests and his collection of gnomes and all the amazing gardens that he built, I was hooked. There was no turning back. I wanted to learn everything that I could about the estate built by Sir Frank Crisp. And so that's how I became interested in Friar Park. Another question that I get asked a lot is, how big is Friar Park? And whenever I get that question, I'm not sure if it's about the house or the gardens. A lot of people think that the house has 120 rooms. In fact, I even thought that in the early days. But that's incorrect. The mansion probably has around 3 dozen rooms, many of which were repurposed over the course of time. After all, Sir Frank and Lady Crisp had half a dozen children, and they had nannies, and they had a staff that was required back in the late 1800s, and they had guest rooms for many of their visitors who stayed for extended periods of time, and they had nurseries and offices for the staff. And as we know, George Harrison had only one child, and so obviously the way George Harrison lived at Friar Park was much different than the way the Crisp family lived at the estate in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And as far as the property itself, Sir Frank Crisp had roughly 90 acres, which included a lot of land across Gravel Hill and on the other side of the road where Friar Park is today. By the time George Harrison acquired the estate, it was roughly 30 acres. Another question I get asked a lot is, how much money did George Harrison spend restoring all the gardens? Well, the answer to that specific question is 0. And that's because George Harrison did not restore all of the gardens, even though there's always books and articles that say that he did. After all, he didn't have as much land as Sir Frank Crisp did. And also, many of the trees that Crisp had planted had grown so large over the course of time and had populated so much space. I mean, we're talking about the course of nearly a century, that many of the gardens that were once there could not possibly have been restored or replaced even if George Harrison wanted to. But of the gardens which he did, George Harrison likely spent quite a bit of money. And Pattie Boyd and Chris O'Dell mentioned in their fantastic books that when George bought Friar Park, the grounds and gardens were in pretty rough shape. And the man-made lake didn't even have water in it. It was supposedly filled with all sorts of debris that needed to be cleared out. And it's been said that George gave some Hare Krishna devotees World War II era flamethrowers. And they went down there and they cleared that all out, which must have been an interesting sight to behold. And sometimes people ask me, who was Frank Crisp? Well, Frank Crisp was a famous lawyer, and he was a partner in a very large firm in London. He was knighted in 1907, and he was created a baronet in 1913. Some people like to accuse him of being be eccentric. But he wasn't. He was incredibly smart, he was mentally stable, and he was a visionary. He also had a lot of money to spend, and he decided to spend a lot of it creating a sort of museum of gardens at his country estate called Friar Park. Here's another question that I get asked quite a bit. It's actually more of a statement, and I really wish people would stop saying it to me, but I'm not sure if that'll ever happen, and it goes like this. Did you know that Friar Park was built as a monastery? That's why it's called Friar Park, you know? So my answer to that is no, I didn't know that, and that's because it's not true. The estate was built by Frank Crisp as a country home for him and his family to go to on weekends. And he acquired two properties. One was called Friar Park, and the other one was called Friar's Field. The word friar was probably the surname of one of the owners hundreds of years ago. And after Sir Frank Crisp passed away in 1919, the estate was sold to Sir Percival David. And he lived there for a long time, decades. And upon his divorce from Lady David in the 1950s, the property was acquired either by direct sale or maybe even donation by the Salesian sisters, who mostly used it as a Catholic school for local children. Based on my research and speaking to people that had been there during that time, there were only a few of the sisters who even stayed on the property itself, and because the house was so cold, they couldn't even afford to heat it, and they actually stayed in one of the lodges on the property. And it's because George Harrison purchased Friar Park from these Salesian sisters that a whole bunch of really lazy writers pass on the incorrect information that Friar Park started off as a monastery. But it didn't. It was empty land. Then there were a couple of houses on it. Frank Crisp bought it, knocked those houses down, and built his estate. And it changed hands a handful of times before being purchased by George Harrison. Another question I get asked a lot is, how much money did Sir George Harrison pay for Friar Park? Well, for starters, George Harrison was not a Sir. He was never given the honor of knighthood. He was an MBE, and that stands for Member of the Order of the British Empire, and it's simply awarded to someone who makes a positive impact in their line of work, whatever their line of work happens to be. In 1970, Friar Park was for sale for £125,000. George and Patty acquired it for £143,000. It seems kind of weird that he ended up paying more for it than the asking price. But he may have acquired some additional land that the Salesian sisters were planning to sell separately, or maybe he acquired some of the existing furnishings. Either way, that was a lot of bread back then, since the average price of a home in the UK at the time was about £10,000. Another question I get asked a lot is, what do you know about the recording studio at Friar Park? Well, here's what I know. It was built by Eddie Veal, who previously had built the first residential recording studio in the UK. He did that for John Lennon at Tittenhurst Park. And George Harrison's studio was top of the line, of course. And it was and still is located on the second floor of the southwest wing of the house. There are some photos of it online, and I produced some ambience videos that people could watch that gives them an idea of what it's like to be in there. Rather than being cold and antiseptic like studios in commercial buildings, George Harrison's home recording studio was warm and cozy. It even had a fireplace. Another question I get asked a lot, which I wish people would stop asking me, is the following. Why are you so obsessed with George Harrison and Friar Park? That's a weird question. Clearly asked by people who don't know anything about me. That's because outside of George Harrison's work with the Beatles and some general stuff that I assume everyone else already knows, I really don't know much about George Harrison's life and career. Now, I do have a copy of All Things Must Pass. It was given to me as a gift, and I listened to it at least once, possibly twice. But I'll tell you, one thing I really liked was listening to the work of Phil Spector, because his work was always amazing. I can name a handful of George Harrison songs after the Beatles, but only the famous ones that everyone else knows. So it's kind of weird for anyone to think that I'm obsessed with George Harrison just because I'm interested in a house that he happened to buy. Because I can guarantee you, if George Harrison never bought Friar Park, I'd still be interested in it. How could I not be? It epitomizes everything that I'm interested in. It's beautiful architecture, it's got a fantastic history, and these really amazing gardens and optical illusions and gnomes. So I just think it's awesome. And I'll talk more about Friar Park in future episodes, but in reference to anyone who thinks that I'm obsessed with Friar Park, I suppose it would make sense to point out that I'm interested in countless English country homes and gardens and similar places of major architectural significance. Friar Park just happens to be the one that you, the person listening to this, associate me with. Interestingly, I know just as much about the Tower House in London, which was built in the late 1870s by art architect William Burgess, and it was later owned by actor Richard Harris and is currently owned by musician Jimmy Page. And yet, no one ever accuses me of being obsessed with them. I think what's interesting when it comes to Friar Park is that most people are interested in George Harrison, and they see Friar Park as part of his history. Whereas I am interested in Friar Park, and I see George Harrison as just being a part of its history. So it's kind of the opposite, but either way, we meet in the middle, and everyone's learning quite a bit over the course of time about Friar Park and George Harrison's life there. So that's all good. Another question I unfortunately get asked a lot, which I wish people would stop asking, is why don't you stop talking about Friar Park? Don't you think it's a violation of Olivia Harrison's security and privacy? Did you get her permission to write books and to talk about Friar Park? Do you have any idea how weird that sounds to somebody like me? Think about this from my perspective. I make a living writing and lecturing about historic homes. Friar Park was built in the late 1800s. It was famous long before George Harrison was even born. Just because most people never heard of it before George Harrison bought it, or they only care about it because George Harrison bought it, doesn't mean that's the case with me and with countless others around the world. Also, it's not my fault that George Harrison bought it, and it's not my fault that he died and left it to his widow. I mean, what if he left it to his son? Would it be a violation of his privacy if I talked about it? What if George Harrison left Friar Park to one of his siblings or his cousins? Would talking about it be a violation of their privacy? What if he left it to the International Society for Krishna Consciousness? Would it be a violation of their privacy if I talk about Friar Park? So I just don't understand the weird obsession that some people have with George Harrison's widow. It seems kind of weird. Of all the rock stars in the world, I don't know how many wives and widows other people can name. I mean, I guess a handful. Yoko Ono, and, people know who the other Beatles were married to. But, Ozzy Osbourne. But beyond that, how many people sit around thinking about the wives of musicians that they like? It's a bit creepy. And in reference to the whole permission thing, that's a bit annoying too, because I think about it this way. What if, while George Harrison was still alive, I contacted him, and I asked him for permission to write a book about Friar Park, and he said, yeah, that sounds great, go ahead and do it. And then he dies. Then what? Do I then need to write a letter to Olivia and ask her for the same permission? And so what if I do, and she says yes? She goes, great, go ahead and do it, that sounds fantastic. And then a week later, she sells it to Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Do I then need to write a letter to them and ask them for permission? And then, let's say they don't get a chance to answer me. The letter's just sitting there on their desk. And then they go ahead and sell it to somebody else. So then, whose permission do I get? I'm already working on the book, doing some lecturing, talking about it, and the house is not yet sold. At that point, whose permission do I get? Do I write a letter to the new people? When does it end? When is somebody like me allowed to stop asking people for permission to write about a 19th century house that they happened to buy and that they played no role whatsoever in building? And so questions like that are kind of weird to me. If I wrote a book and lectured about Buckingham Palace, do I need to write to the Queen and ask her for permission? What if I wanted to write and lecture about the White House? Do I need to write to whoever the current president happens to be and ask for their permission? So it's a bit weird, and I really can't wrap my brain around why people are obsessed with Olivia Harrison's privacy and security. In fact, in reference to that, I wonder what people think her life is like and why she would be concerned about some architectural historian writing about an old house that she inherited. Do you think that somebody out there is going to read one of my books or listen to something that I say or watch one of my videos, and they're suddenly going to drop everything they're doing and go to Friar Park and hop the fence just because I wrote or spoke about the history of the estate? And let's say that happens. How far do you think someone like that would get? I assume that everybody is quite aware that Friar Park has planned to give security, right? And I know that people like to think that rich and famous people are normal because they look like us and you see them smiling in photographs. But their lives aren't like ours. The family of George Harrison, at least Olivia and Danny, they have hundreds of millions of dollars. Trust me when I tell you, their lives are not like yours. I know you see them at events and they smile and you take a photograph with them and maybe you get an autograph and you're like, oh, Olivia was so nice to me. But that's just the way it is. You know, when you're famous, when you're well known, you turn it on. You smile, you shake hands with people, you take a little photograph, you make some small talk. But listen, 10 seconds after you walk away from somebody like that, they don't know who the hell you are. If you bumped into them in the street, 20 minutes later, they won't even recognize you. That's not belittling them. It's just the way it is. I mean, you've probably gone to book signings and that sort of stuff. This is their job. Smile, nod, say something nice, and then move on to the next person. And so Olivia Harrison, and I'm assuming Danny, they're surrounded by security. And they should be. Just like George and Olivia should have had a lot of security when that weirdo broke into their home that time. But backing up a bit, let's just say somebody reads one of my books, they become obsessed with Friar Park, and they try to get in and they hop the fence and they make it all the way up to the house. And let's say they make it into the house. What makes you think that Olivia Harrison would even be there? I assume you know that George Harrison had several enormous estates in different parts of the world, right? I suppose that it's possible that Olivia sold them by now, but whether she did or she didn't, you know she's got to have other homes, right? In London and California and who knows where else. So she probably wouldn't even be there even if some weirdo did that anyway. And even if they did, I'm telling you, it's not because I wrote a book and posted some photos about Friar Park. That's just not the way the world works. So people really need to calm down about Olivia Harrison's security and privacy. I'm sure she's got that covered. And she doesn't need some weirdo George Harrison fan being overly concerned about that sort of thing. So people can really just chill and relax, and let's just keep on talking about Friar Park because there's so much to learn. It's a really amazing place. Another question that I get asked a lot, which is also kind of like a statement, is the following. Did you know that George Harrison called it Crackerbox Palace? So my answer is no, he didn't do that. Crackerbox Palace was simply the title of one of his many songs. And his friend, comedian Eric Idle, directed a promotional film for the song at the estate. And so I can see why people would think that. But listen, I've spoken to plenty of people who knew George Harrison very well and have spent a lot of time at Friar Park. And I can tell you this, not a single one of them ever told me that he referred to Friar Park as Crackerbox Palace. Why would he? Friar Park is actually a cooler name, and Crackerbox Palace was just the name of a song. So where did he come up with the name Crackerbox Palace? Well, he didn't. That was actually what comedian Lord Buckley called his own home, located in California. And I have shared photos of Lord Buckley's Crackerbox Palace online and also in a video that I produced. Another question that I get asked quite a bit is the following. Is Friar Park open for tours? I am planning to go to England next year and I want to visit. So the answer is no, it's not open for tours. Friar Park is privately owned by the estate of George Harrison. Of course, it is entirely possible that it might someday be donated to the National Trust, but probably not. The estate of George Harrison has an endless stream of money coming in, and they always will. So they could handle whatever the costs are and will always be in order to maintain it. Now, it would be great if they could open up the estate someday, maybe for private events to generate money for assorted organizations, but neither Olivia nor Danny have any responsibility to anybody to do that. And besides, we don't know what George Harrison's desires were, but they do. We also don't know much about Danny, outside of the fact that he's a musician and a very wealthy man. No doubt he has dealt with a lot in his life, just like many other children of the rich and famous. After all, how many times do you think he has been out and about, minding his own business, and some strangers approach him to say how much they loved his father? No doubt by now he's got it all down, smile, nod his head, say thank you, and be polite and all that. But it's got to drive him a bit crazy being in the shadow of his famous father throughout his entire life. And the same goes with Olivia. I mean, what do you think when you see a photo of her? Do you think anything outside of, that's George Harrison's widow? That's it. That's all you really know. And that's likely by design. So it seems to me that when I talk about Friar Park and I showcase the estate in my books and in lectures, in many ways I think that it's beneficial to Olivia and Danny because it shows them in a positive light, in an interesting roundabout kind of way, because it shows that they have a vast amount of knowledge about something that one might not normally associate with the widow and child of a very famous musician. That's because through their association with Friar Park, by living there and by sheer osmosis from those who have worked for them, they are now able to converse about things like architecture and design and restoration and gardening and landscaping and horticulture and the history of the estate, including Frank Crisp and so on. So I think that my sincere interest in Friar Park, rather than being a violation of their privacy, actually elevates their image by showing them in a light outside of the shadow of George Harrison. But that's just my assumption. You would actually know if that is the case more than I do. After all, when you look at photos of Danny and Olivia, what do you think? Do you think of music? Do you think of George Harrison? When I look at photos of them, and it doesn't happen often, but when I do, I associate them with Friar Park and the incredible amount of knowledge that they must have in their mind associated with this grand estate. In any event, Friar Park is their home. And we really don't know if Danny has a bunch of kids somewhere, and they might be being raised in Switzerland or someplace for the benefit of their privacy, so they don't have to deal with what he and others like him have dealt with. And if that's not the case, he's still a young dude and he can still pump out kids in the future, and Friar Park can remain, as it was always meant to be, a beautiful, private home where friends and family can gather and generate priceless memories. And so, this concludes this episode of the Beatle People podcast. What do you think of Friar Park? If you were rolling in dough, would you live in a place like that? You know I would. Please like and share and subscribe to the show on whatever platform you were listening on. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.